outputs. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Tatiana has given a summary of the kind of essential background to the project, so I won't go over that again. But just to be clear, that the research was really focused on exploring the ways in which strategic scale work on surface water management through things like local flood risk management strategies, surface water management plans, work on the new drainage and wastewater management plans, how that kind of activity at the strategic scale could be used to inform the planning system, so that the requirements that are set within planning are not just addressing surface water risks on a kind of site-by-site basis, but they're addressing risks in a more strategic fashion. And the research had three aims, which I'll just run you through. So firstly, reviewing the current situation. So how effective is that relationship working currently between strategic surface water work and the planning system? Secondly, looking at the potential for improvement. So looking at advantages, disadvantages, barriers, opportunities. And then finally, coming up with recommendations for improving the relationship between strategic surface water management activity and the planning system. And that was followed by four more specific research questions. So the first of those was, what evidence is there currently of strategic surface water management being implemented through planning? Secondly, how can strategic surface water management approaches support net reductions in surface water flood risk? Thirdly, obviously a key aspect is the coordination between planners and those who are involved in strategic surface water management work. So we looked at the relationships between all of the various parties involved. That was our third question, looking at coordination. And then finally, we looked at the extent to which current national policy and guidance supports the kind of strategic approach that we would like to see, and if not, what would need to change to enable that to happen. This is a kind of overview of the methodology that we took. So split into two main tasks or phases, if you like. The first one, a desk-based phase, identifying a range of case studies, firstly, in conjunction with DEFRA and with our project advisory group. And then secondly, reviewing all of the relevant literature relating to those case studies. And through that, we tried to get a really good overview of the range of approaches out there, how widespread they are, and how effective they are in practice. And then in task two, we really tried to build on the findings from task one with more in-depth exploration of the opportunities for better integrating strategic surface water management with the planning system through various forms of engagement that you can see on the slide there. So in-depth interviews with case study stakeholders and other stakeholders, an online survey with the water companies specifically focused on issues of data and data sharing. And then finally, a workshop which allowed kind of collaborative discussion of ideas and solutions. You can see on that slide there, they're the case studies that we came up with. We had a very long list to start with, and that was the short list that came out of the other end. You can see the selection criteria on the slide there that we utilised to make sure we had a really good mix of different types of case studies. So I'm going to talk you through the findings. I'm going to keep it very brief so that we can give most time to the kind of vision and recommendations section at the end. So excuse me if it feels like I'm kind of racing through it. You'll have to wait for the report to see the detail here. First research question was about the evidence currently of strategic surface water management being implemented through the planning system. The research that we conducted was qualitative, as I've shown in the previous slide. It was case study based primarily. And we need to be careful, therefore, in making kind of quantitative assertions about the extent to which strategic surface water management is being used within the planning system currently. But having said that, finding suitable case studies for inclusion in the research was extremely challenging. And more than one member of the project advisory group indicated that they weren't aware of any genuinely strategic approaches to SuDS delivery through the planning system, which perhaps indicates that surface water management is currently playing a limited role really in securing SuDS through planning. Although there were some promising emerging exceptions, including the two cases referenced on this slide, the very interesting, exciting work going on in Hull and East Riding with the Living with Water Partnership, and work going on in Central Bedfordshire with an integrated catchment model feeding into their local plan. But overall, limited evidence of strategic approaches. Then we focused specifically on the extent to which any local planning authorities were achieving net reductions in flood risk, and not just kind of maintaining current risk levels, but using new development to deliver net reductions in surface water risk. And again, we found that apart from exceptions like the Ashford reference here on the slide, drainage objectives in new developments were limited to site-specific considerations and maintaining existing levels of risk. We did find some isolated examples of net reductions being achieved, including in Northumberland, as on the slide here. But these weren't typically as a result of planning policy, but more through negotiation with developers in areas that had a history of significant flood events. So what clues did we gather from that limited evidence as to how strategic approaches could be delivered through the planning system? There's a list on the slide here of some of the factors that appeared to be key in terms of moving towards a more strategic approach in planning. I won't talk you through them here because they all come up in the recommendations section that I'll come on to, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a taster of the kind of things that are important in moving towards a more strategic approach. In terms of coordination, I think the overview on this slide here really captures it quite well, in that there are numerous examples of strong collaboration between risk management authorities, but efforts generally are being constrained by a lack of resources within some parties, inconsistencies in methodologies and metrics and so on, that make it difficult to transfer and to utilize data, and other barriers to data sharing as well. The one thing that I thought it worth really drawing out in relation to this particular research question was the pivotal role that lead local flood authorities play in acting as the kind of interface between strategic surface water management activity and the local planning system. And that interface role is something that features quite strongly in our recommendations. You know, just recognizing that role and making sure that that role is properly resourced and effective in practice. We identified lots of opportunities for improving coordination in order to deliver more strategic approaches, and some of the key themes are shown on this slide. So building understanding among all of the various actors involved of their roles and responsibilities, aligning those responsibilities better, improving resourcing for engagement, improving consistency in the methodologies and the metrics that are used to design and to model drainage systems and to model surface water flows, and improving data sharing. And then in relation to current national policy, I think that whilst we identified opportunities to really strengthen policy, and I'll come on to that in the recommendation sections, the key message is that there's a gap between policy and practice. So currently, national policy does encourage a strategic approach to surface water in local plans, but as I've already shown you in the previous slide, that's not being carried through into practice. And there's a clear sense amongst the people that we spoke to through this research that surface water is not really being afforded the same priority as other sources of flood risk. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the findings, and I'll come on to the vision and recommendations now, and we split this up into 5 sections. And the first section is on data and data sharing, and the vision here is one where accurate and comprehensive data on surface water management is available to all parties, drawing on consistent and up-to-date data sets held by all of the risk management authorities. And in terms of the recommendations, firstly, this whole issue about the metrics and the methods and the standards that are used in measuring, modelling, planning for surface water, there's a lot of inconsistency out there. And we recommended that Commission be researched to investigate the reasons behind that and to identify ways of improving consistency so that data can then be more easily transferred and utilised between the different parties involved. Secondly, we identified a need to improve access on drainage data that's held by large private landowners. One of the barriers that was referred to by some stakeholders was simply getting access to data on drainage networks in universities, hospitals, large private landowners. Getting hold of that data is a real challenge in some urban areas. Thirdly, we recommended that research be commissioned to understand the reasons for the wide variations in the scope and the type of data that's held by the water companies on surface water. Again, in some areas, there's a shortage or even an absence of any drainage networks data held by the water companies, and we think there's a need to understand the reasons behind that and to address those reasons, because that is a significant barrier to building the data on surface water and drainage in some locations. On evidence base and strategy, so thinking, what do we do with that data, and how it's then incorporated into the evidence base for planning. Strategic flood risk assessments are the kind of core piece of evidence in relation to flood risk that all local plans draw from. So they're obviously key to this. And the vision that we set out in the report is where SFRAs are consistently informed by the appropriate supporting evidence and clearly specify the level of surface water mitigation which is needed in different locations in the local plan area. So recommendation number one was that guidance be provided on how to develop SFRAs, specifically identifying or addressing the question of what evidence is needed to sit behind SFRAs. There's currently a huge amount of diversity in approaches, different types of studies and strategies being delivered in different locations. And we think there's a need to really understand the role that these different studies and strategies can play so that greater consistency can be achieved. Secondly, that guidance be provided to support local planning authorities and lead local flood authorities to translate that evidence base into a costed strategy for surface water interventions, where we found good practice, where more strategic approaches were being achieved. A common factor in that was the lead local flood authority, sometimes the local planning authority, haven't taken the evidence that next step into strategy, thinking about what specific schemes are needed, what do they cost, and that then provides the basis for negotiation with developers, for integrating with community infrastructure levy, Section 106, local infrastructure planning. So, and that step seems to be really important, and we think there's a need for guidance to support that. Thirdly, that greater clarity be provided on the role of drainage and wastewater management plans in relation to the planning system. Currently, they seem to be playing little or no role in the planning system, and we think that could be a missed opportunity and needs some consideration. Fourthly, that the LLFAs are made integral to the preparation of strategic flood risk assessments. That pivotal role that we talked about in interfacing between strategic surface water management and the planning system, that one of the mechanisms that can be achieved and really capitalized on is through LLFA involvement in the preparation of strategic flood risk assessments, and we think that needs to be made integral. So moving on to the local planning system, and the vision here is one of local plans clearly identifying, so using the evidence base to clearly identify the sites and areas in which over attenuation of surface water is needed as part of a strategic approach to surface water management, and that is then followed through into the development management process. And the recommendations here, firstly, that local planning authorities should set local policies which require net reductions in surface water flood risk where this is needed. As I say, it's currently supported by national planning policy, but the vast majority of local planning authorities seem to just set generic standards for drainage across their local plan area. Secondly, that mechanisms be developed to ensure that SuDS are considered in the earliest stages of development. very difficult to get net reductions to over attenuate surface water if SuDS are introduced at the last minute of the design process. So getting SuDS considered early on is crucial, and we think there could be consideration given to LLFAs having specific powers to provide and to charge for pre-application advice. Some are finding a way to do that anyway, but there's room for an enhanced role in that area. Thirdly, that the role of LLFAs be strengthened as a statutory consult. So LLFAs are a statutory consultee on major planning applications, but there's a sense out there that that role is not really strong enough, and that their advice can too readily be ignored, and there's perhaps a need to really strengthen that role, to strengthen their voice on major planning applications. And then in terms of the minor applications that they would not normally be consulted on, we think there's scope for LLFAs to define areas of high risk, areas of where there's perhaps lots of development taking place, where they might need to be considered even on minor applications, and we certainly identified one LLFA that are already doing that, and that seemed to us to be sensible given the potential cumulative impacts of lots of minor developments in some locations. And then finally, for all of the other stuff, all of the minor applications that planning officers just deal with routinely, they really do need to be equipped to carry out that role. So there's a need there to think about the kind of training that's given to planners routinely in order to fulfill that very important role. Next on collaboration. So the vision here is about the roles being clear and about there being a recognition of the long-term mutual benefit to be gained from collaborating on surface water management across those geographic and organisational boundaries. So the EA have been tasked with putting together some guidance, new guidance on partnership working, and we think there's an opportunity to include consideration of local planning authorities within that guidance. That could help to really strengthen the links between local planning authorities and the flood risk management authorities. And the guidance could also specifically address the role of highways authorities. Lots of concern out there that in some locations the role of highways authorities is somewhat disjointed, somewhat disconnected from other work going on to manage surface water. So again, there's an opportunity through this new guidance to address that question. Thirdly, that the role of the water companies in surface water management should be more closely aligned to the delivery of strategic surface water management. There was a clear sense out there that they're somewhat constrained in their ability to engage effectively in this topic because of the current focus of their statutory duties. And then finally, the government should consider whether there are contexts in which the right to connect to a public sewer might be reasonably withheld so that strategic approaches can be facilitated, encouraged in areas with very constrained sewer networks. And then the final section, so national planning policy and guidance. The vision here is that national planning policy and guidance is unequivocal on the need to give equal weight to all sources of flood risk in local plans and in development management activity as well. and that national planning policy and guidance requires local planning authorities, in conjunction with other risk management authorities, to articulate a strategic approach to surface water management, I should say, in local plans. So, as I said, national planning policy currently encourages strategic approaches in local plans, and we think that needs to change to require strategic flood risk assessments to identify where those net reductions in surface water risk are needed and how this can be achieved, so that that can then be used in local plan policy. Secondly, and work is ongoing on this already, I understand that planning policy on the status of surface water risks be clarified, so that they are assessed and are considered and given equal weight as fluvial and coastal flood risks. Thirdly, the whole issue of the adoption of SuDS, it's a thorny question, but our recommendation is that greater consistency is needed, so that the approach that's adopted by different organisations in different locations is more consistent, so that that's not a barrier to delivering strategic approaches to surface water management. Fourthly, that the proposed new design codes should specifically reference the need for a strategic approach to surface water management, and should recognise the multifunctional benefits of SuDS.
5 minutes left, Tim.
Yep, brilliant. This is my final point. So, yeah, finally, the implementation of those design codes should be responsive to the evolving evidence base on surface water risks. One of the concerns that was expressed by various parties is that there's a risk of kind of locking in approaches through the design codes, and that may not be appropriate in the case of flood risk, because the evidence base on those risks is constantly evolving, and design codes need to be flexible enough to respond to that evolving evidence base. So that's a very kind of high-level summary of the vision and the recommendations. There's lots more detail in the report itself on what we mean by each of those recommendations, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of the outcomes from this research. And if I could just add finally my thanks to all of the people who assisted with this research. These were the advisory group members, representatives from each of these organisations, and lots of others in the case study locations as well, who contributed to the research. So thank you to all of you. I know some of you are on this call. Thank you. I'll hand back to Emma for the Q&A.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tim.